Switch Lite. I've got to say that I love it, and I'm not entirely sure I'll be using the standard model anymore. And on the face of it, that sounds ridiculous. It's a cheaper, pared back version of the hardware that loses a bunch of features, but would you believe it? The Switch that cannot actually switch is an absolute triumph, demonstrating quite spectacularly that beyond the hybrid console functionality that defined the system, this was always a handheld at its core, and a brilliant one at that. Yes, the new model is cheaper and significantly simplified, but there's the sense that having settled on designing a dedicated handheld companion product, Nintendo aimed to make it the best it could possibly be. So, is it perfect? No. Is it worth buying though? Absolutely. The simplicity of the Lite is perfectly summed up when you first open up the box. Beyond some supporting cardboard, the contents consist of the console, the power supply, a flimsy manual, and that's it. Compared to the standard Switch with its additional Joy-Cons, the grip, the Joy-Con straps, the dock, the cables, you immediately get the sense that this is a no-nonsense, zero-fuss alternative. It's not trying to dazzle you with anything big and clever. As worthy as some of the Switch's stuff may be, it's a handheld console, plain and simple. Good news for everyone, except for those who specialise in unboxing videos, I guess. Lift out Switch Lite from the packaging and it's immediately apparent that this isn't a rerun of the cheap but robust, almost agricultural handheld for kids formula we saw with the 2DS line. This is a small, light, beautifully designed device. Decent quality matte plastics. They aren't exactly premium grade, but the device still feels great in the hand. When you first power up the machine, it's difficult not to be smitten. The screen may be smaller, but it's pin sharp, bright and beautiful. But hey, this is me, right? And looking at things from a glass half empty perspective, the handheld focus and cheaper design does mean that you're losing quite a lot of features. Even though it would have been simplicity to add, the USB-C port lacks any kind of docking support right now, meaning that if you wanted to add TV support somewhere down the line, you can't. And to be clear, the unit won't even fit into the standard dock anyway if you're trying to connect it to an HD TV. Not that it would work anyway. No kickstand also means no tabletop play if, say, you own a Pro controller. That's a bit of a pain, but not so much of a loss when the standard model's kickstand is a bit on the rubbish side anyway. The good news is that the USB-C port still has data transfer support, meaning that USB peripherals work just fine. It's just the video output that's been cut then. And I can demonstrate that quite nicely here. This is the Mayflash Magic NS, a USB-based pass-through device and Bluetooth receiver for controllers. It's pretty cheap, but it lets me use a whole host of controllers with my Switch, whether it's the DualShock 4, Xbox One pad, Xbox 360 pad, or many more. They just all work. Everything routes through the USB-C port and it works just as well here as it does on the normal Switch. So, USB on the Lite then. No video output, but everything else is present and correct. Returning to the features we've lost though, well, being a dedicated handheld, there are no detachable Joy-Cons. Standard controls are part and parcel of the package, and to be honest, that's the way I prefer it. Fewer moving parts means less that can go wrong, and a proper classic Nintendo D-pad is restored into the bargain. However, this does mean that games using HD Rumble, the IR pointer, or Joy-Con motion controls either lose functionality or are ruled out altogether. Now, you can wirelessly pair Joy-Cons to the new unit if you want, but you won't be able to charge them. The only other cutback I noticed is that the screen's auto brightness adjustment feature is gone, suggesting that the sensor used in the original Switch is also absent in the Lite. But I don't know about you, but I can live without it. Having covered everything the Lite can't do, we should focus on what it does actually deliver, and that begins with the cute form factor. In terms of dimensions and volume, Switch Lite is 22% smaller than the standard model. The thickness though, the depth, is essentially unchanged, but what really sets it apart is, well, how light it is. Quite apt, bearing in mind the name. At 275 grams, it's 123 grams lighter than the vanilla Switch with Joy-Cons attached and 31% lighter overall. The simplified design and controllers go a long way in miniaturizing the device and losing heft. But the Lite also uses the new T2110B01 rendition of the Tegra X1 processor, codenamed Mariko, which, as regular viewers will know, is a smaller, cooler and more power-efficient rendition of the original chip. Power draw can be 40 to 50% lower than the original Switch processor, so Nintendo takes the opportunity to reduce battery capacity, a key component in shrinking the form factor. The 16 watt-hour battery of the standard Switch is miniaturized to 13.6 watt-hours, a 15% reduction for the Lite. The good news is that the Mariko processor, backed up by more efficient LPDDR4X memory, more than makes up for this shortfall in battery capacity. While the Lite can't hold a candle to the revised Mariko Switch in terms of battery life, it still lasts a fair bit longer than the original model. So let's put some numbers on that, using our standard Zelda Breath of the Wild power consumption test. Switch Lite lasts 16% longer than the original model at 50% screen brightness, rising to 28% longer with the brightness slider pushed all the way to the max. Effectively, that's an extra half hour of gaming, rising to 40 minutes if brightness is indeed pushed to the limit, which it may well be in the outdoors after all. In fact, a max brightness Lite has about the same stamina as an OG model running at 50% brightness. So, yes, these are impressive figures, but the lower battery capacity also means good news for recharging as well. While the Switch Lite is still relatively slow to charge compared to smartphones and the like, the fact is that it gets you back to full capacity 45 minutes faster than the original model. As it's USB-C based in terms of charging, external power banks still work just fine for extended play sessions. Now, this was something of an essential add-on for the OG Switch, and I suspect it'll prove just as useful for Lite owners. There's good news on the thermal side of the equation too, as I discovered when looking at the Lite through a thermal camera. A smaller device running the same processor at the same clocks as a larger equivalent, the new extended battery life Switch, well, you'd think that it would be more likely to retain heat. However, the Switch Lite pulls off a neat trick. While the vent is indeed marginally hotter, the actual skin of the machine itself is actually slightly cooler to the touch. These measurements were taken after an hour of play at max screen brightness and with the battery charging, so maximum heat generation here from all angles. Okay, so Nintendo hasn't been able to deliver a passively cooled Switch. There is still an active fan within, but after our sustained stress tests here, the device was still silent to the point where even placing the vent directly to my ear, I just couldn't hear a thing. In fact, discerning whether the fan was active at all took extreme measures. I couldn't feel anything by running my fingertips over the vent, only by licking my lips, which are more sensitive than the fingertips, and placing them near the exhaust could I feel any movement of air at all. So, pretty good then. Switch Lite is stacking up pretty well overall then. If you're looking for a handheld with more sustained battery life, the revised version of the original model is the one to get, but the Lite still has better stamina than the launch machine, especially so if you prefer to game with the display ramped up in brightness terms. Now, this suggests a more efficient screen as well as a less thirsty processor. Skin temperature under stress tends to max at 43 degrees, cooler than other Switches, while the vent at the top there is a little hotter. Bottom line though, it's very comfortable to hold. As for the screen itself, I think it's a bit of a gem actually. Obviously, it's smaller than the original Switch's display at 5.5 inches versus the 6.2 inch original. And I also think it loses some degree of contrast compared to other models in that colours don't feel quite as rich, while blacks don't feel quite as black. However, there is the sense that it's the brightest screen of the bunch. Well, the bunch of switches I have available at least. And while it may be simply down to a temperature adjustment compared to the other models, the white point certainly looks more properly white than either of my other units. So yes, the slight yellow tint of my original switch is not present, while the very obvious red shift in my Marico equipped new switch is totally gone. Now let's just bear in mind here that screen photography can be a little tricky, but the shots I'm using here are a pretty good representation of how my trio of Nintendo handhelds compare in terms of their displays when stacked up side by side. All three images are derived from the same single photograph, so you can get some idea of how the displays differ, as well as how much real estate you're losing on the Lite compared to the established design. Okay, so let's move on. In Digital Foundry Switch game reviews, we've often looked upon the system more as a high-end handheld as opposed to a do-it-all, take-anywhere home console. Mobile is what the core technology was designed for and where it works best, while the integrated screen has an almost magical ability in helping to make the necessary technical compromises required to run on Tegra X1 look less noticeable. Obviously, with Switch Lite, the smaller area and identical resolution could, in theory, help even further with this effect. The new model has a 267 ppi screen versus the 236 ppi of the original, so it's smaller, but detail is more dense. Well, this one is difficult to nail down, but even with heavily blurred dynamic resolution scaling titles like Wolfenstein and Hellblade, there is some sense of extra clarity. The pin-sharp native 720p titles like Zelda Breath of the Wild certainly look fantastic with a 1-to-1 pixel match. Performance-wise, it's difficult to test the Switch Lite in the way we could test other versions of the console because, well, obviously, HDMI output is not available. However, the same processor and revised memory configuration is in the revised model, and in my review of the extended battery life Switch, I noted how it has a very small performance advantage in what looked like memory bandwidth limited gameplay scenarios. So from what I understand, the new LPDDR4X memory is rated for 2133 MHz and downclocked to match the older model, and as a consequence of that, latency timings on the RAM may be tighter, and this could explain the small boosts I was seeing in my performance tests. Now, obviously, for the Lite, we don't have access to our usual HDMI-based tools, so I filmed the Switch Lite playing a Mortal Kombat 11 replay, where the advantage of the Marico setup versus the original Logan model can be repeated at will based on identical gameplay. What you're seeing here are results from my Marico Switch review showing that the new chip does have that advantage there. Now, what's interesting about MK11 is that rather than skip frames, replays literally slow down. By extension, filming the screen in mobile mode on both models, old and Lite, and comparing the length of the replay and associated stutter points, this should confirm whether the new model's slight performance upgrades extend to the Lite as well. And yes, just like our OG versus Marico head-to-head there, comparing the original model to the Lite is completing the replays a touch faster. So the advantages that the extended battery life Switch had over the original model do seem to extend to the Lite as well. In conclusion, it's very difficult to level much criticism at Switch Lite. Nintendo's miniaturization effort has paid off handsomely with a cheaper cutback machine that still ranks as one of the best handhelds I've ever used. It's nicely put together with a brilliant screen, and arguably it possesses a more agreeable portable form factor than the other Switch models. If there's one negative point beyond the lackluster Wi-Fi, which clearly isn't a priority for Nintendo, annoyingly, well, that would be reserved for the ABXY button cluster. Similar to the standard Switch, the buttons are tiny and sit very close together. With Nintendo sitting down for this one with a blank sheet of paper in design terms, well, perhaps this could have been improved, but it hasn't. Additionally, while we would want to verify this one ourselves, the recent news from YouTube channel Spawnwave that Switch Lite's analog sticks may well have the same drifting issues as the original Joy-Cons, well, that's also concerning. But beyond cursory nitpicks and, well, those genuine concerns about the nature of the sticks, I've got to say that the Switch Lite is a lovely handheld. I'm not sure I can ever remember wholeheartedly recommending an offshoot device that actually strips back the initial offering and removes features, but for my money, Switch Lite still feels like a whole complete product at a really nice price point. It works because it focuses on one aspect of the overall Switch experience, and for my money it's the most crucial one, handheld gaming. Now, which Switch to buy depends very much on the extent to which living room play is important to you. But beyond Digital Foundry work, I've always played Switch titles exclusively in handheld mode. And given a choice between the original model and the Lite for portable play, it's the smaller, cuter unit that I'd prefer to pack in my bag. Well, that's Switch Lite then, and I hope you enjoyed this review of it. You know the score by now. Please do like and subscribe to support what we do here at Digital Foundry. Ring the bell for instant notifications whenever a new video goes live on the channel. And yes, Digital Foundry patrons, genuinely, we love you. It's your direct support for the team that makes many of our projects possible. And if you're not a patron and you love what we do, please do consider joining up. It really, really helps. And of course, you get pristine quality video downloads of everything we do. But that's all from me for now. Thanks for making it all the way to the end of this video, if indeed you did. And of course, just generally, thanks for watching.